It is the autumn of 1940, and a man calling himself Willem ter Braak has just stepped off a small boat onto the shingle shore of a quiet stretch of the English coast near Dungeness. He speaks passable English. He carries a wireless set, forged papers, and a cover story. A Dutch refugee fleeing the German occupation. He has been trained by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, drilled in tradecraft, given money, given contacts, and given a mission. He looks, on the surface, every inch like an ordinary civilian making his way through a world at war. But within hours of stepping ashore, something is wrong. Not something dramatic. No chase through dark streets, no hand on his shoulder in a crowded train station. Something smaller, something almost embarrassingly trivial. A police constable in Rye looks him over, notices nothing obviously suspicious, and yet something about the man feels off. He makes a note. A report is filed, and Willem ter Braak, along with every other Abwehr agent who landed on British soil during the Second World War, is rolling towards capture. By the end of the war, the British Security Service, MI5, had caught, turned, or neutralized every single German spy who set foot in Britain. Not most of them, not the majority, everyone. It is one of the most extraordinary intelligence achievements in modern history. And while much of the credit has rightly gone to the double-cross system, to codebreakers at Bletchley Park, and to the extraordinary network of double agents who fed false information back to Berlin, there was another layer to Britain's success that received almost no attention at all. It was not a radar system. It was not a cipher machine. It was not a code. It was a collar stud, a small pressed metal collar stud of the kind any British gentleman might use to fasten his shirt. Utterly unremarkable, invisible to the untrained eye. And yet, for every Abwehr agent who landed on British shores dressed as a civilian, it was, quite literally, a death sentence hiding in plain sight. To understand why a collar stud could betray a man, you first need to understand how German spies were prepared and what Britain looked like in 1940 when their training began. Germany had been watching Britain for years, but the actual business of equipping agents with convincing cover identities had accelerated dramatically following the fall of France in June 1940. With invasion seemingly imminent and espionage suddenly urgent, the Abwehr threw considerable resources at the problem. Agents were recruited, largely from neutral countries or from nationals of occupied territories who could claim refugee status. Given forged identity documents, British currency, and civilian clothing sourced or copied from continental suppliers. The clothing was the problem. European tailoring in 1940 was, in many respects, different from British tailoring. Not wildly different, not obviously different, but different in ways that, once you knew what to look for, were absolutely consistent. The cut of a lapel, the stitching along a hem, the precise construction of a waistband. These things varied subtly between a suit made in Hamburg and one made in Leeds, and British-trained observers, police officers, Home Guard volunteers, and MI5 field officers had been specifically briefed on what to look for. But the collar stud was the detail that gave agents away most reliably and most completely. In Britain, the standard shirt collar of the period was attached to the shirt body by a detachable collar system. The collar itself was a separate starched piece of linen, fastened to the shirt using small metal studs, one at the front, one at the back. These studs were a standard piece of British haberdashery, sold in every draper's shop in the country, and their design was specific. A small flat head, a short post, and a split pin or loop mechanism at the base that held them in place against the collar band. In Germany, and across most of continental Europe, this system had largely been replaced by attached collars sewn directly onto the shirt, which had become standard civilian wear throughout the 1930s. The Abwehr's clothing procurement teams, working quickly and under pressure, had in many cases outfitted their agents in shirts that were either continental in origin or copied from continental patterns, which meant that when an agent arrived in Britain wearing what appeared to be a perfectly normal British suit, and a constable or home guard officer asked him to remove his jacket or looked carefully at the collar of his shirt, there was frequently something wrong. The collar might be attached when it should be detachable. The stud might be absent when it should be present. The stud, if present, might be of a continental pattern, slightly different in dimension, slightly different in construction. That was simply not sold anywhere in Britain. And a man claiming to have been living in London for 3 months, or to have arrived from Scotland the previous week, with a shirt collar that had never been near a British haberdashery, was, by that fact alone, lying. It sounds almost too simple, and that is precisely what made it so devastatingly effective. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of detailed history coming. The British authorities had been thinking carefully about the problem of enemy agents before the first one had even landed. MI5, under the directorship of Sir Vernon Kell, and then, from 1940, under a series of reorganizations that brought in new blood and sharper thinking, had assembled what amounted to a comprehensive catalogue of the material differences between British civilian life and its continental equivalent. Clothing was only one category, but it was among the most reliable, because it was so difficult for the Abwehr to correct. The Germans were not entirely ignorant of the problem. There is evidence from captured documents and from the debriefing of turned agents that the Abwehr was aware that clothing details were drawing attention to their operatives. Some efforts were made to source genuinely British garments, buying clothes from British retailers operating in neutral countries, or through intermediaries who could acquire second-hand British items. But these efforts were inconsistent, expensive, and time-consuming. And even when an agent was provided with a genuinely British suit and a genuinely British shirt, there remained the question of whether those items looked worn in the right way, whether they had been laundered by British methods, whether the combination of garments a man was wearing actually matched how a British civilian of his apparent class and profession would dress. The collar stud was particularly difficult to fake convincingly because it required not just the correct object, but correct knowledge of how it was used, how it was inserted, how a British working-class man versus a British professional man would wear his collar, and crucially, what condition the collar and stud would be in after several days of use. An agent who had been briefed that he needed a collar stud, but who had spent his adult life wearing attached collars, frequently wore the stud incorrectly, or had a shirt that bore no marks of habitual stud use, or held himself in a way that suggested physical unfamiliarity with the mild constriction that a starched, detachable collar imposes on the neck. Compared to the systems deployed by Germany's own counterintelligence operations, British screening methods in 1940 and 1941 were arguably more sophisticated precisely because they focused on material culture rather than purely on document examination. German counterintelligence at border crossings relied heavily on paperwork, identity cards, travel permits, ration books, and on questioning. These things could be forged or rehearsed. A man's shirt collar could not be rehearsed. It either matched the country he claimed to belong to, or it did not. The Americans, when they entered the war and began developing their own counterintelligence screening operations, were briefed extensively on British methods and incorporated material culture checks into their own training programs. The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, produced detailed field guides on the differences between American, British, and European civilian dress and behavior. The collar stud and similar indicators appeared in these materials as a primary screening tool. No comparable systematic attention to these details has been documented in German training materials for agents destined for Britain. The Abwehr's failures were numerous and structural: betrayal, incompetence, infiltration. But the persistent inability to dress their agents convincingly in the material reality of the country they were entering was a thread that ran through case after case. What is the actual historical weight of all this? The honest answer is that it is difficult to isolate. The double-cross system was the dominant reason that German espionage in Britain failed. the systematic turning of captured agents into conduits for disinformation, was an intelligence triumph of the first order. The breaking of Abwehr communications through signals intelligence gave British authorities advance warning of agents' arrivals in some cases. The general social environment of wartime Britain, in which strangers attracted attention and communities were tight-knit and watchful, made operating clandestinely genuinely difficult. But the material culture checks, the collar stud, the suit cut, the stitching, the shoes, the way a man held a cigarette, served as an early warning and rapid identification system that accelerated the process of arrest and, crucially, created the opportunity for agents to be turned rather than simply imprisoned. An agent caught quickly before he had made any compromising contacts was an agent who could plausibly be presented to Berlin as still at large and operational. And that was the foundation of the double-cross system itself. MI5's files on individual captured agents, many of which were declassified from the 1990s onwards and are now held at the National Archives at Kew, contain repeated references to clothing anomalies as part of the initial grounds for suspicion. The historian J.C. Masterman, who ran the double-cross system and wrote the first detailed account of it, noted that the speed with which agents were identified after landing owed something to the thoroughness with which British civilians had been trained to notice what did not belong. Willem ter Braak, the agent who landed at Dungeness in the autumn of 1940, was never turned. He evaded capture for several months, longer than most, and was eventually found dead in Cambridge in April 1941, apparently having taken his own life when his money ran out and his mission had failed entirely. He is, in many ways, an exception that proves the rule. He avoided arrest for longer than his colleagues, not because he was better equipped, but because he avoided contact and simply disappeared into the landscape. His mission produced nothing. He sent no intelligence. He made no contacts. He was a ghost, and ghosts do not win wars. Every other Abwehr agent who came ashore in Britain during the war was either captured, killed, or, most usefully of all, turned. The collar stud did not win the intelligence war on its own. No single thing did. But it is a reminder of something that the great machinery of wartime intelligence sometimes obscures. That the difference between a convincing lie and an exposed one is often something very small. A piece of pressed metal, a detachable collar, a detail so ordinary that it is invisible to the man wearing it, and unmistakable to the man who knows what he is looking for. The Germans sent trained, motivated, courageous men into Britain. They gave them forged papers, wireless sets, and cover stories. They gave them everything, in fact, except the one thing that mattered most. They did not give them the right collar studs, and that, in the end, was enough.